The leash went slack at the worst possible moment, and the veteran felt it before he understood it. The dog had stopped, not from fear but from focus, body low, muscles locked, breathing suddenly controlled in a way that didn't belong on a quiet street. What looked like confusion to everyone else was calculation, something old and dangerous waking behind steady eyes. Hands reached where they shouldn't have. Shadows closed in. The dog didn't bark, didn't lunge, didn't panic. It simply shifted its weight like it had done once before under very different skies. And that's when they realized something was wrong, but what had they just triggered? The veteran had learned how to live quietly after the war, choosing routines that didn't invite attention, mornings that began before the world woke up, walks taken along the same cracked sidewalks where nothing ever changed, because predictability was a kind of peace he could control. The dog fit into that life like it had always belonged there, a solid, broad-chested animal with a coat the color of wet earth and eyes that never stopped measuring distance, movement, intention, even during moments that were supposed to be ordinary. Their days were simple. Early walks, long pauses at intersections, the veteran's hand resting lightly on the leash as if touch itself were reassurance, the dog moving half a step ahead but never pulling, always checking back without turning its head, reading pressure through the line between them. To strangers, the bond looked unremarkable, almost dull, just another older man and his large dog moving through the city's forgotten edges, but there was a gravity to the way the animal positioned itself, how it chose corners instead of centers, how it scanned reflections in windows rather than the street itself. The veteran didn't talk about the years that came before, and the dog didn't need him to. Both carried their past in posture and habit, in the way silence was never truly empty around them. They lived in a small apartment where light came in late and left early, where the dog slept facing the door and the veteran slept better because of it, where storms were measured by how closely the animal leaned against his legs and not by the sound of thunder. Neighbors knew the dog was protective but gentle, the kind that sat patiently while children passed and never reacted to shouting, yet something in its stillness unsettled people who paid attention long enough. Over time, small things began to feel off in ways that were easy to dismiss if you wanted to believe the world was harmless. Footsteps that slowed when they slowed, glances held a beat too long, a car that appeared twice on the same block on different days, always idling, always facing the wrong direction. The dog noticed before the veteran did, its gait tightening, ears flattening not backward but outward, widening its awareness like a net being cast. On one walk, it paused beneath a street light that flickered like a warning heartbeat, refusing to move forward until the veteran adjusted course, and later that night the dog paced the apartment instead of sleeping, stopping at the door as if listening for something that never came. The veteran told himself it was age, nerves, habit, but his hand lingered on the leash a little longer the next morning, and he chose busier streets despite hating crowds. Even then, the dog stayed alert, not anxious, not reactive, but ready, as though the calm of their life was something temporary, something borrowed. The city kept moving around them, indifferent and loud, but the space between man and dog felt charged, stretched thin by an approaching moment neither of them could name yet, only sense, the way pressure builds before a storm breaks, the way instinct sharpens long before danger steps out of the shadows and makes itself known. The change did not arrive all at once but crept in through small fractures in routine, moments so brief they could be dismissed if fear had not already tuned the senses sharper, and the dog felt it first, always first, its body tightening on walks that had once been automatic, its head lifting toward sounds swallowed by traffic before human ears could separate them from the noise. The veteran began to notice how often the dog stopped at corners without command, how it angled its body between him and passing strangers with subtle precision, how it slowed whenever footsteps approached from behind, not turning to look, simply listening, measuring cadence, intent, weight. The city seemed to lean closer as days passed, alleys growing narrower, streetlights failing earlier, shadows thickening into shapes that lingered longer than they should. One afternoon, as clouds pressed low and the air carried the metallic scent of rain, the dog froze mid-step, tail lowering, chest expanding as if drawing in more oxygen than necessary, and the veteran felt a ripple of unease pass through the leash, a tension not born of fear but readiness, the same tension he remembered from years ago when waiting meant survival. A pair of men crossed the street without reason, their reflections breaking apart in the darkened windows, and though nothing happened, the dog did not relax until they were far behind, ears still canted outward, listening to the city breathe. That night, the animal slept lighter, shifting at every distant sound, rising once to stand silently at the door for several minutes before returning to its place, eyes never fully closing, and by morning the veteran felt the weight of being watched even inside his own home. The walks changed again, routes altered without conscious decision, longer paths taken to avoid blind corners, Yet the sense of pursuit sharpened rather than faded, confirmed by a car that idled too long near the curb, by a hand that brushed too close as someone passed, by a sudden silence in the dog where there had once been easy calm. The animal began positioning itself differently when they stopped, placing its body across the veteran's legs as if anchoring him, its gaze flicking between doorways and parked vehicles, its breathing slow and deliberate, and when a stranger laughed too loudly nearby, the dog's head snapped toward the sound with such intensity that the veteran felt his pulse spike. Rain came in heavy sheets one evening, flattening the city into reflections and muffled echoes, and under that cover the feeling of threat grew bolder, closer, until the veteran noticed a shadow pacing their movement across a block, always staying just outside the circle of light. The dog's hackles did not rise, its mouth did not open, but its muscles coiled like steel cable, and when the veteran shifted the leash to adjust his grip, the dog shifted too, blocking him instinctively, claiming space without aggression, a living barrier shaped by something deeper than training alone. A hand appeared briefly from between two parked vans, retreating when the dog's eyes locked onto it, and though nothing followed, the air felt wrong afterward, heavy with intention. Over the next days, the men returned in fragments, never fully visible at once, sometimes only a shoulder vanishing behind a corner, sometimes the low murmur of voices cutting off abruptly when the dog turned its head, and with each encounter the animal's behavior grew more deliberate, its movements smaller but sharper, conserving energy, choosing when to react and when to remain perfectly still. The veteran began shortening his stride unconsciously, mirroring the dog, trusting the silent communication that flowed through the leash, and once, as they passed a closed storefront, the dog stopped so suddenly the leash slipped loose from his fingers for a fraction of a second before he caught it again, heart hammering, while the animal stood unmoving, eyes fixed on the darkened glass where a distorted reflection lingered just a beat too long. The moment passed without incident, but the veteran felt the aftershock of near loss settle into his chest, the realization that someone had been close enough to reach. From then on, the dog no longer allowed anyone within arm's length, subtly widening the circle around them, adjusting pace to force distance, and when the veteran tried to reassure himself that nothing had happened yet, the animal's vigilance answered with a truth words could not carry. One afternoon, beneath a sky bleached pale and indifferent, the dog began pulling not forward but sideways, guiding him away from a familiar path, and seconds later a figure stepped out where they would have been, pretending to check a phone, eyes flicking upward too quickly, and the veteran felt a cold clarity settle in, understanding that coincidence had expired. The dog's behavior changed again after that, not escalating into aggression but refining into something colder, more calculated, its eyes tracking hands rather than faces, its ears tuning to whispers buried beneath traffic, its posture lowering as if preparing for impact. The city itself seemed complicit, doors slamming shut without warning, lights flickering at the wrong moments, the veteran's sense of isolation deepening as if the world had narrowed to the length of a leash and the animal at its end. On a night when fog rolled in thick enough to swallow buildings, footsteps followed too closely for too long, and when the veteran turned instinctively, the fog showed nothing, yet the dog stopped dead, body angled protectively, teeth bared just enough to signal readiness without sound, and the footsteps retreated in a hurry that betrayed intention. The veteran slept poorly after that, dreams bleeding into waking moments, but the dog remained anchored, patient, as if waiting for a line to be crossed. That line came closer with each passing hour, with each repeated sighting, until the tension between them and the unseen threat stretched tight enough to vibrate, and on a gray afternoon when the leash slipped slack for the briefest instant again, when shadows moved too quickly and hands reached too boldly, the dog shifted its weight in a way that promised something irreversible, leaving the veteran with the terrifying realization that whatever was coming next would not end quietly. The moment arrived without warning, as moments like that always do, not announced by sound or spectacle but by a sudden tightening of the air, a subtle wrongness that snapped every instinct into alignment, and the leash went slack as the veteran's fingers lost their hold in the same instant that hands surged out of the shadows with confidence born from believing an old man and a dog were easy targets, bodies closing in from angles chosen carefully, too carefully, the city dim and indifferent as. The dog moved before the veteran could even draw breath, not lunging blindly but pivoting with terrifying precision, its body dropping low, weight shifting forward, muscles unfolding with the memory of drills carved into bone and nerve under heat and chaos far from this street. And in that instant the illusion shattered because this was not a startled pet reacting in fear but a weapon waking up, eyes locked, breath controlled, movements stripped of hesitation, the dog placing itself between the veteran and the threat with a speed that erased distance, forcing the first attacker back not with teeth but with presence alone, a sudden wall of force that broke their rhythm and exposed their mistake, while another figure reached again, desperate now, and the dog answered with a blur of motion so exact it felt choreographed, snapping the space inches from flesh, stopping just short, sending a message sharper than pain, freezing them in a moment of disbelief as they realized the animal was choosing restraint, not struggling to find control but exercising it, and the veteran saw then what he had always felt but never named, the truth hidden beneath quiet walks and gentle routines, that this dog had once been trained not just to protect but to dominate chaos, to read threat in posture and breath, to move faster than intent, to end violence before it bloomed, and the attackers felt it too as the dog circled with calculated steps, never turning its back, herding them away from the veteran, cutting off angles, forcing them into the open where light stripped away their advantage, the city finally bearing witness as passers-by slowed and phones lifted, the men stumbling now, confidence draining into panic, because this was not the response they had planned for, not a bark or a bite but something colder and more final, a predator that understood restraint was power, that terror could be delivered without blood, and when one of them tried to bolt, the dog moved again, faster than thought, closing the gap and stopping short once more, teeth flashing in the space where flesh would have been, eyes burning with intent that spoke of orders once given and followed without question, and the veteran stood frozen behind it, heart pounding not with fear but with awe and a deep, aching recognition, memories surfacing of other nights, other streets, other moments when survival depended on trust placed in a creature that could act without words, and in that suspended heartbeat the attackers broke completely, stumbling backward, hands raised, retreating into the same shadows that had emboldened them moments before, the dog holding its ground until they vanished, body still coiled, breathing steady, scanning for reinforcements that never came, and only then did it turn back, pressing briefly against the veteran's legs, anchoring him to the present as sirens wailed somewhere distant and the city resumed its noise, leaving behind the wreckage of a plan undone, and the truth settled fully now, undeniable, that they had not tried to steal a dog at all but had stepped unknowingly into the orbit of a guardian shaped by war, and they would carry that realization for the rest of their lives, because the street had chosen a side, and it had been standing quietly on a leash all along. When the noise finally receded and the street returned to its ordinary rhythm, the aftermath unfolded slowly, like a body learning how to breathe again after being held underwater too long, and the veteran stood there longer than necessary, one hand resting on the dog's back, feeling the steady rise and fall beneath his palm, grounding himself in the simple fact that they were still standing, still together. People gathered at a distance, concern and curiosity mixing in their faces, but none of it mattered the way the weight of the leash did once it was back in his hand, once the familiar pressure returned, reassuring in its quiet constancy. Sirens came and went, questions were asked and answered, and eventually the street emptied again, leaving behind only the echo of what could have happened and didn't. The dog remained close throughout it all, posture relaxed now but awareness never fully dimming, as if the switch that had been flipped could not simply be turned off, as if vigilance had become a permanent part of its breathing. Later, in the small apartment where light still arrived late and left early, the veteran sat on the edge of the bed while the dog settled at his feet, angled as always toward the door, and for the first time in a long while the veteran allowed himself to feel everything at once. The fear he had suppressed, the gratitude that tightened his chest, the recognition that the animal beside him was not just a companion but a guardian whose instincts had been sharpened by a past as heavy as his own. Sleep came in fragments that night, interrupted by memories he hadn't visited in years, images of harsh sun and dust and the sound of breath through clenched teeth, but each time he stirred, the dog was there, solid and present, eyes opening briefly to confirm he was still safe before closing again. In the days that followed, the city seemed to soften its edges just a little, as if the danger had retreated, not gone entirely but reminded that it had misjudged its prey, and word traveled quietly among neighbors who noticed the dog differently now, not as a large, calm animal but as something more deliberate, more capable. The veteran adjusted too, not retreating inward as he once might have but standing a little straighter on walks, trusting the rhythm they had always shared, allowing the leash to be a connection rather than a tether. He paid closer attention to the dog's signals, honoring pauses without question, changing direction when the animal suggested it, understanding now that what he had once thought of as quirks were in fact communications, warnings offered with patience and restraint. There were moments when his hand trembled unexpectedly, when the memory of reaching shadows returned uninvited, but the dog responded without being asked, leaning into him, applying just enough pressure to remind him where he was, anchoring him to the present with a weight that carried comfort instead of fear. Over time, something inside the veteran eased, not erased but reshaped, the knowledge that he was no longer alone in guarding his own survival settling into something like peace. He began taking longer routes again, not because he felt reckless but because he felt protected, because trust had replaced the isolation that had once defined his days. The dog aged as all living things do, gray creeping into its muzzle, movements slowing slightly but never losing purpose, and the veteran aged alongside it, their routines adapting, their bond deepening into something unspoken but unbreakable. The world remained unpredictable, capable of cruelty and opportunism, but it also revealed moments of quiet kindness, strangers who nodded with respect rather than suspicion, neighbors who looked out for them without being asked, a subtle shift in how the street received them now that it understood what they represented together. On certain mornings when sunlight spilled across the sidewalk just right, the veteran would pause and watch the dog take in the world, ears twitching, nose testing the air, and he would feel a surge of gratitude so strong it caught him off guard. Gratitude not just for protection but for companionship, for the way two beings shaped by hardship had found a way to carry each other forward. The past did not vanish, but it lost its sharpest edges, transformed into something that informed rather than haunted, and the veteran began to sleep more soundly, dreams less urgent, waking with the reassuring presence of the dog at his side. In time, the memory of that day on the street became less about danger and more about revelation, about the understanding that strength does not always announce itself loudly, that courage can walk quietly on a leash, that loyalty forged under fire can manifest in moments of absolute clarity when it matters most. The veteran never spoke publicly about what the dog had been trained to do, never sought recognition or spectacle, content to let the truth remain where it belonged between them, in the way the dog still positioned itself protectively without being asked, in the way the veteran's hand still rested instinctively on its back at night. And if the city ever tested them again, if shadows ever gathered with the same intent, the outcome was already written, not in aggression or fear but in the unshakable bond between a human who had given everything once and a dog who had learned how to give it back. A reminder that survival is not just about enduring threats but about finding something worth standing guard over, something worth protecting with every quiet step forward, and that sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones who never needed applause, only a chance to stand between the world and the person they love.